Perfect.
Okay, good afternoon, folks, as we continue to battle our technical issues. Welcome back. Welcome back after a wonderful lunch. We hope that we don't put you to sleep. And we have a very good presentation lined up for you and also wonderful speakers with us. First, I'd like to call upon Sameet Gupte, CEO of Servion Global. Sameet Gupte has about 20 years of diverse experience building organizations across various geographies, US and Europe, currently based out of London. Servion is a leading CX player, leveraging cloud and nonlinear delivery models to service their clients. Sameet, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks. As we go.
Yeah, it's on. It's on.
This one. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Liz does have slides and they're awesome. I've seen them. So you can't hear me? Can you hear me? No? Yes? They can't?
Thank you. Yes.
She's just...
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you so much for being patient. My name is Sameet Gupte. I'm the CEO of Servion. I'm based out of London. I would like to welcome all of you. A very good afternoon to you. We have a very interesting session, and as I was saying, amazing stuff that Liz is going to share with us. Very interesting topic. The last 2-3 years, we've seen a significant change in what's been happening in terms of the delivery models, the execution models, but more importantly, the ecosystem, right? What's happening between a consumer, a customer, a vendor, a partner, and what is expected from this ecosystem, what is expected out of the end-to-end.
Ooh, sorry.
All right, end-to-end marketplace. And so, very eager to hear what Liz has to say, because these models are changing. The future's sort of to be defined. And with that, I would like to introduce Liz. Liz has been an analyst with Forrester for the last 15 years. Many of us could have seen her being quoted on Forbes, Fortune, giving opinions about the future and the way things are moving in our industry. She not only works with partners, but she also advises customers in terms of their buying patterns, what should they look for in a partner or a vendor, what kind of delivery model, how the contracts. Can you hear me now, or should I just start from here? Is this better? Can you switch this off? Sorry, so as I was saying, Liz not only works with the partners, but I think the most important aspect of what she's been doing over the past 15 odd years is working with customers, sort of looking into the future, helping them evaluate what kind of vendors and partners, technologies, kind of execution models, type of contracts that they should be having with their partners or their vendors. So with that, I would like to call Liz on stage. Liz?
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Put a hand up if you have any trouble hearing. Well, I hope we've gotten all the technical difficulties out of the way for your whole event, because that was quite a handful there. Not sure what all happened. Can always rely on technology to go wrong when you need it. And then the backup, too. Anyways, I'm Liz Herbert, and I'm an analyst here at Forrester Research, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to jump right into it, because we've got some great research going on at Forrester right now as we're living through probably the most disruptive time that most of us will experience in our careers. And what we've seen in the past few years, roughly the past 7 or so years, is we've seen this effect where consumer lives, we call it the Sunday night experience, are starting to bleed into expectations in the employee's world. And so it's creating all sorts of new pressures, not only for companies who serve consumers, but also for how we work. And a lot of what we've been doing over the last 20 years that has made us successful will no longer work. We see that companies in every industry, and that means your customers, that means Forrester, and that means all of your companies, are facing an existential crisis. That many of our companies, if we don't change now, if we don't adapt and evolve, will fail. We will not survive. That's how big this shift is that's ahead of us. So now, before I get into too much of the major disruption, I wanted to share some fairly positive news. At Forrester, we have a team of people who look at data, sizing numbers. We compile this not only from what buyers are telling us they'll invest in, but also looking at vendor revenues and studying economic data around the world. And so I wanted to share with you some data from a report that came out pretty recently that's talking about the overall outlook for software and services. And I gave you a heads up. The news is pretty good. We are seeing continued growth. Here what you're seeing is a breakdown across services at the top, outsourcing and hardware maintenance next, consulting and SI in the green, software in the blue, communications in the light gray, and then computer equipment at the very bottom. And what you can see is that, first of all, overall, we're forecasting growth. This is, by the way, looking at it in US dollars. For any of you who are Forrester clients, we also have it in local currency. But I thought this would simplify the overall picture. We see pretty good growth for 2018. Of course, there's numerous factors that could throw this into jeopardy, such as political instability and changes in consumer confidence and interest rates and all sorts of other factors. But we also predict that that growth will continue going into 2019 at a slightly lower pace. And those of you can probably quickly pick out which category you fall into, but the news is good across pretty much every category. Even categories that we're saying are less relevant than they once were or are not growing as fast, we're still forecasting growth. And I also wanted to show you a breakdown by region. I know that, of course, we're here in India, but I know many of you represent companies that are selling and servicing around the world. And so here you can see how our forecast breaks out by some major geographies. Feel free to take some pictures here, but you will also be getting the slides, so don't feel obligated to. Again, you can see a very positive story. I won't go through this in too much detail, but we're forecasting growth pretty much across every region. Some are a little bit smaller in terms of the magnitude, such as EMEA, as well as Latin America. There's not a huge amount of growth, but overall, the outlook from this angle is pretty good as well. Now I want to introduce something that's pretty notable about what's driving the growth. We at Forrester, we've started to categorize technology and technology services into two buckets. One is what we call back office technology. This is what some people call IT. It's the systems that run the company. The other part we've started to look at separately is what we call business technology, BT. These are the systems that directly impact the customer's experience, whether you're B2C, B2B, B2B2C. Those are the systems like the CRM system, the marketing, the order system, the website, the mobile app, and on and on and on. So with that as an introduction, you'll see that in each category, whether you talk about BT or whether you talk about back office, there's upkeep on the existing spend, and then there's net new spend. And what we're seeing is that the growth overall, when you look at what we count in BT, is a lot faster and stronger than the growth that we see in back office. But back office is still growing at a healthy clip. Actually, the whole wave of digital disruption is driving plenty of investments in core IT, in core systems such as ERP, as you look at companies really have to pivot their entire organization to be more nimble and more agile and ready for the digital disruption that's coming. So now I wanted to hone in on two specific elements that we're looking at in some of our market data and forecast numbers. First is cloud, and then I'm going to take a look at what we call digital. So with cloud, this might surprise some of you, but when we really cull through the numbers and we look at what software vendors around the world, big and small, specialized and broad, are reporting for their numbers, we see that cloud software is now at about 1/3 of spend on all commercial software. Actually, in some categories, it's over 50% of the spend that we'll see in 2018 is on SaaS and cloud applications. Categories like CRM, HR, cloud is becoming the de facto way to buy. Every leading provider in those categories is either SaaS only or SaaS as an option that's growing in popularity. And we're seeing cloud rise all around the world, even in industries or geographies who previously thought we can't because of regulatory issues or we can't because there's no data center in our country. We've seen dramatic changes in cloud over the last few years. For example, Workday, Salesforce, very North America-centric companies, and a lot of clients around the world were claiming, well, they don't have a data center in my country, so we can't use them. Those two, and those are just examples, they're moving aggressively to change that. Salesforce started partnering with the likes of T-Systems in Europe and also companies like AWS to get local data center options available in different markets. Salesforce is pretty far along that journey. Workday, another example. They've started to partner also with AWS to get in-country data center options. Also, many SaaS and cloud suppliers, certainly all the big ones, they're spending more money on security, either directly or through outsourced partners that they use, than most enterprises can spend. And so we've also seen that data center options are expanding and security is improving. And all of these trends are coming together, including the maturing of these cloud products, to create an environment in which more and more companies are saying, not only are we going to use the cloud, we're going to pursue a cloud-first strategy when we make purchases. And a lot of the myths that we saw the last 20 years when cloud was just starting up, let's say from the late 90s till today, are no more. The idea that cloud is not secure, the idea that you can't customize or extend cloud, the idea that cloud is only for small point solutions, all of those have been challenged and proven wrong. I happened to be at an Oracle analyst meeting last week, and they announced that Oracle, the entire corporation globally, is now running their financials on the Oracle Cloud. So, I mean, not that many companies bigger or more diverse from a country standpoint than that. Of course, they do have a little incentive to get that working. I also wanted to show, I know a lot of you here represent services companies. The services industry has been dramatically changed by the rise of cloud. Here you see some numbers that we've put together, and you'll see that the cloud-related services work is much smaller than all the rest of the work. But you'll also notice something dramatic. It's growing fast, whereas the other one is growing at a smaller clip. And this is a pattern that we've noticed going back some time and that we predict will continue into the future. But that's not really the whole story. For most of the services companies that I work with, it's not really a question of should we leave behind our legacy business that's making us millions and billions of dollars a year and move to the cloud, but it's a question of what exactly do we deliver as services for the cloud. Because as buyers go more and more to the cloud, the services will follow. But what we're finding in our research is that the requirements of a leading services provider in a cloud deployment are very different. They're much more about process enablement, change management, integration and orchestration. There's a lot less technical heavy lifting and support because that is subsumed in the cloud platform. Uptime, upgrades are the responsibility of the SaaS and cloud vendor. So if you're a services provider who's coming from more of that classic world, you've got a couple of options. Maybe several you should take at one time. One is you could sell traditional services to SaaS providers. They still have to do a lot of the tasks that we've seen end users dealing with over the last 20 years. The other, of course, is pivoting the business to what these customers directly are looking for and need. And so we've seen a lot of growth from those companies who are able to be strong in consulting, be strong in business process, but also work differently, work in smaller, more flexible, agile teams. Because companies, when they deploy cloud, they don't go after a big bang deployment. In fact, companies do that less and less generally. So now I wanted to do a quick spotlight on digital. And I wanted to show you some data. I won't read through all of it, but I'll get to the punchline. Our data, when we surveyed buyers in 2017, showed that buyers are significantly focused on what we call digital operations. They're significantly focused on modernizing the core. Many of the clients that I work with, they've already thought about digital as more of a marketing-led solution or more of a point customer-facing solution. But increasingly, they're realizing that if they don't transform the entire organization, that they will not be very successful. An example is a marketing strategy that starts looking at weather data, and starts advancing into maybe predicting when raincoats are going to be sold the most. If what's missing from that is the supply chain, the manufacturing, the ability to actually get those coats out, that's a very disappointing customer experience, worse than before all the sophisticated marketing tools and analytics got into the mix. So that's just one example. And on that note, I wanted to show you one of our key themes as Forrester when we talk to our clients about what digital business really means. We try to convey the idea that there are several elements to it. It can't be a front-end play. It can't be a marketing-led initiative. Operations and experience both have to be tackled. But it's also more than that. It's about digital innovation at the intersection of those two areas and thriving in a world of digital ecosystems. And I'll say a little bit more about both of those points as I get to the next section. So now I wanted to move into sharing 6 trends that will revolutionize technology and business. Because at the end of the day, why do customers buy technology? It's generally to drive their business. Of course, we know they don't all think like that. But generally, that's the main goal that they are or should be striving for. So let me get into them. The first trend that we've been tracking at Forrester is that we believe that we are in what we've named the age of the customer. Actually, others use this terminology too. It's clear that customers are more powerful than ever and that they're driving different behaviors at the organizations with whom they engage. But one of the things that we have identified in the research is that customer experience can correlate with better revenues, better profits, but only when thought of holistically. So I alluded to this earlier when I showed some of the other data, but I wanted to show you this visual of the iceberg, because this is what we see a lot of companies thinking about when they think we're going to be focused on our customer. They focus on certain metrics that are external and should be, like customer surveys, net promoter scores, customer interfaces like the web and the mobile. But they oftentimes neglect the entire core, which is hindering them. Example, I worked with a utilities client in North America whose business had a new idea for how they could become more engaging with their customers. They wanted to create a mobile app. They thought they could have a smart experience where, since the app would already know if there was a power outage, it could turn into a flashlight. It could be proactive about working with the consumer on energy consumption. A lot of noble ideas. The problem is the business group saw the problem as very isolated to the app. And when you really dig into what's going on at that company and many others, it's running off a decades-old legacy system that simply wouldn't be able to do activities like that. And that's the classic tension that we continue to see. But we believe we're at the beginning of a next phase of this customer experience leading the way, in which companies that can tackle the whole iceberg, and that's your customers as well as all of you in helping them, are the ones who are going to stand out the most. The second trend is the cloud. I talked already about cloud adoption. Here you'll see some of our more specific data by application area. Here you're seeing a look of product revenue in billions. But there's a lot more to it than just a new deployment model. Actually, Forrester asked me to start covering the shift to the cloud way back in 2004. And a lot of people in the market started thinking, this is just a new deployment model. This isn't going to be anything more than the ASP model was. But that's not what we've seen. We've seen that cloud, pure cloud, where it's one-to-many in nature, is highly disruptive to customers and to the technology supplier side. When you have a one-version system, it unlocks all sorts of new possibilities. For example, do you know that when you use Salesforce, you create a custom application? Let's say you're Air France, and you create a custom application, you can share that over the marketplace, and Delta Airlines can consume it. They're partners, they might share apps. Not something that would typically be possible in the legacy on-premises world when you had so many different combinations of deploying software systems and so many different versions out there at any given time. Also, we see that with the cloud, it creates a more natural environment for a repository of data. So for example, Workday. They're trying to disrupt the HR process. And one of the things that they've started to do, which is opt in for their customers so that they don't get scared off, is that they cull through data on when employees leave the company and why. And more than that, what you can do to stop the employee from leaving the company. Maybe it's a person who's starting a family and needs a more flexible schedule. Maybe it's someone who's getting frustrated with the pay. Their analytics learn across the whole base of their customers. And more we're seeing that that is a capability that multi-tenant, one-to-many cloud providers are able to deliver. But even more than that, we see that this many-to-many environment of a cloud can underpin new business models. For example, Whirlpool, which is a large appliance manufacturer, had many negative issues with customer experience over the past 10 years. And one of the key problems with Whirlpool is that they lost ownership of the customer relationship. Mostly people, at least in the US and some other major markets, buy Whirlpool through a retailer like a Home Depot or a Lowe's. Usually their only exposure to the customer is when something is broken, when there's a service call. And the net of this was that they had a terrible brand. And so what they did was they used a piece of IBM Cloud to start connecting the suppliers of parts to the customer, to also the repair technicians, which are all different entities. And by doing that, they were able to really shore up that service process. But in the future, this also underpins the new business model that they're heading down, which is the connected appliances who can repair themselves if we're not too scared about a repairman coming into our house through the smart lock when we're gone. Third trend is AI. Some of my colleagues at Forrester, and again, any of you who are clients can read the full report, they've recently published some research saying that the AI honeymoon is over. AI is not particularly new. It's been around for decades. But we are seeing something different now. AI is becoming a clear element of the strategy for customers and for leading technology suppliers. And what we believe is that here in 2018, we're going to see AI move from what it's been, which is a bit experimental, trying things out, playing around with different tools, to something where the hard work will begin. Because of course, AI is only as good as the data, it's only as good as the governance, it's only as good as the processes. Some of these topics that aren't so new and fun and interesting are the same old topics that have plagued enterprise deployments for years. Another topic around intelligence, blockchain. This again is a highlight from one of my colleagues' pieces of research. And what we believe is that blockchain does ultimately have the power to disrupt, and anyone who is in a technology, software, or services company should be experimenting with it. But we also think that we are still a bit far off from a time when this will really drive new business models. In fact, we think for all the hype and all the talk, it's still fairly immature in terms of where it's going to go in the next decade. The fifth of the 6 trends is that customers are going to start investing in platforms. In fact, I was meeting with an energy client who was talking to me about exactly this. You know, more and more companies in energy, healthcare, even banking, they realize that they can do something much more disruptive if they become more open and more part of a platform. You see this in agriculture as well, with a lot of the data sharing and the agronomics that's now starting to take place. And what's significant about this change is that it's a complete 180 from where companies were before, where they thought that anything innovative had to be shut down in the 4 walls and not go out to the ecosystem, certainly not go out to competitors. And this shift towards platforms has many implications for the technology supplier community. One, technology suppliers will be the owners of some of these platforms. Customers will also be the owners of some of them, and likely will use technology suppliers to make those happen. The other big implication is that a lot of new work will emerge around understanding the data, the privacy, the analytics, because a lot of companies like this idea in practice, but when you really get down to the idea of them sharing data with their competitors in their markets, you start to run into a whole host of other issues. And the last of the 6 trends is this idea of the long tail of innovation. You know, in the last couple decades, a lot of clients wanted to work with trusted suppliers. We have a sourcing and vendor management council at Forrester. I've worked with many of the members of that council. And a lot of them in the past would set out rules like, well, we would only really bet something big on a big supplier. I mean, minimum has to be either by our spend with them or by their total revenues. We want to keep out these risky bets. And if the supplier can't clear all of these hurdles, we're not working with them because we're big and we can't take that risk. But something interesting has gone on in the last couple of years. Small companies can innovate very easily. They're not taking a big risk. They're building a new business. Leading large enterprises are willing to take risks, either through a stealth group within the company or sometimes across the whole company, especially if the threat is looming large. And what that means is that companies of all sizes, and in particular the very large enterprises, are now thinking differently about how they can work with very small suppliers. They realize that blockchain innovations and AI and Internet of Things are actually coming more from startups than they are from the established players, or at least they want to see what those startups are doing. And that means that technology suppliers have more of an imperative to connect and to help these different companies see who's out there, but also balance that other need that we still see, which is how can you do it in a safe way? One example is marketplaces. Software suppliers such as Microsoft, SAP, Salesforce, they now have marketplaces. AWS is another example. And not only are those places where someone can connect to a lot of possibly disruptive technologies, but also we're seeing more of a trend towards those owners of those marketplaces doing some vetting, looking at the architecture, the security, the financials, the customer health, or other metrics, so that you're not just going into a blind marketplace that hasn't been vetted at all, and the power of that connection becomes something more. So I hope those 6 trends give you an idea of what we're looking out ahead as Forrester. I did want to hit on a point that I believe is close to home for all of us, which is what are these changes that are going on in the buying cycle? Because what we're seeing at Forrester is that they are massive. When companies want to be digital disruptors, when they want to engage in new and different ways, it's completely overhauled the legacy way of buying, which was typically to do a formal RFP, spend months and months doing a selection, and then get going on a project that you pay upfront for. And so we're now talking about the new technology buying cycle, and most of this applies regardless of what kind of technology or technology services company you are. The first thing is right up front in the research. You know, you've got a couple of different factors here. One, buyers are getting more accustomed to seeing and touching either examples or tools before they buy them, and so they're becoming more likely to look for things online, through peers, and really want something that they can see, touch, feel, not just hear about. Closely related to this trend is also the fact of more and more millennials are out there making these decisions, and that's a trend that's only going to keep going as the millennials get older and become in higher positions at their companies. And just by way of example, one of the world's largest hotel chains, who was making a CRM and a CRM services provider decision, called me up one day, and it was a younger person who had been Googling. And one of the questions she had for me was, she said, I read in your report that this particular supplier is really good at Salesforce implementation. But when I Googled it, I didn't see anything, so I'm not so sure. That is a big shift. A couple other things, I won't mention all the points on here, but a lot of companies are now moving away from formal RFPs and big bang projects, and they're doing more agile, iterative projects. It's putting more pressure on things like POCs, but it's also changing the pricing. We're seeing more what we call agile outcome pricing and other more flexible ways of working to align with that new way of buying. Platforms, cloud, and ecosystem approaches, I talked a bit about that. And then the focus on business change more than tech management. And then finally, the long term. You know, what does support look like? The Indian IT economy has made billions of dollars off of support. But in the new world, support is a lot more about consuming these new, frequent upgrades that are coming from the software providers or technology providers generally. And so that means that the new breed of support is more about smaller scale, flexible, fractional resources that can know very specific software or other tech and also help the company learn how do we adapt to those? What kind of business change can we help them with? more so than some of the technology-oriented support that's going on. And I'll come back to some of that support question later. One last major shift that we've seen in the buying cycle, and we have an analyst on my team who's now spending a significant portion of her time looking at this, is the rise of the digital studios. Now, sometimes people scoff at this. They say, well, we've had COEs for years. I mean, what's really new here? But what we're seeing now is that these studios are more than just a showcase. These studios are becoming places where real work gets done. In fact, large providers like Accenture, they have lots of different studios that are purpose-built. So they have some that are more for showcase. They have others that are more for researching and prototyping. And they have still others that are for getting the real work done. And something important to note about these studios, they're being used all across the life cycle, starting with selection and on through to the work. But they need to be local and accessible to the client. I know a lot of companies that I've met with in India, their flagship studio is here in India, which is great for some purposes. But if you've got a client out there who wants to iterate and be in that studio and build their future products regularly, if they're not here in India, they're probably not going to be coming here every week, every month to do that. And so we've seen an imperative to not only invest in these studios, but put them in geographies where the clients are so that they're accessible. And of course, there's other variations of that. Some providers would take an approach of doing it at the client site, renting third-party space, doing it with a partner. And we see this, by the way, with software providers and services providers. SAP has their App House studios all over the world now and growing in number. So lastly, and then we can open up for a few questions, I wanted to talk about what it means. What are some recommendations for the India technology sector, which of course is undergoing massive change the last few years? So the first point I wanted to hit on is the one that I see talked about the most, which is, leading India-based companies, especially in services, built their businesses off labor arbitrage. That is no longer in fashion anyways, based on what the trend is with software. But moreover, anything that you can do in a factory delivery model at scale with junior level people who are 1 year into the workforce can be automated. And that's a huge disruption for the entire delivery model. But it's not necessarily all bad news. It's definitely a change. Companies who have figured out how to create software as a factory or services as a factory are in a very good position when that starts getting more automated. Because companies who do that well already know, how do we break down tasks? How do we make different people doing different tasks work together? And so this can actually turn into an advantage, although we're going to have some bumpy roads ahead. Second is IP and platforms. I meet with dozens and dozens of companies every year. Many are Indian, many are American or European. Almost everybody today talks about IP and platforms. But here we see that a big shift is underway. The platforms need to start talking more about what the value is to the customer. They can't just be accelerators or tools that aren't clearly articulating value. And also, not every supplier has to own all the platforms. Not only are your customers going to be working in more of an ecosystem world, but we're seeing more co-opetition amongst suppliers where services and software companies can and should take advantage of competitor platforms. Every company in the world is not going to invent their own AI platform. That's not going to happen. That's not going to be successful. We will see consolidation, and in many cases, we're going to see a hybrid. There will be some things you do on your own platform and other things, either because of the customer choice or some hyper specialization, will be done on a partner platform, which might even be a competitor. And the challenge for suppliers generally, and here in India, suppliers have tended to be pretty good at building platforms, is how do you get that into more of a business outcome messaging, and then also decide what parts you're going to focus on delivering versus build. And then the last point, although there are others we could say, we've seen a major shift in what's required for your employees to be successful, and this goes for Forrester employees too. We're a consulting firm also, and I know many of you are. Different skill sets are required. Many of you have seen the Infosys investments where they've started on a path of design thinking, and they're now partnering more with local universities to bring some new skills in. We're seeing that initiatives like those and beyond are required to thrive and succeed in the technology world going forward. Employees can no longer get by working behind the scenes, not really understanding what the customer is doing, not really understanding what that customer is thinking about. And we're seeing more and more need to train all employees, even the lower level engineers and tech elements of your employee base, in things like design thinking, journey mapping, in things like business process, industry capabilities. And not that that's brand new to anyone, but the level at which we're going to see that cross-training go on will separate leaders from laggards. So I hope that gave you all some ideas of our overall outlook, some key trends that we see disrupting the market, what's going on in the buying cycle, and then some specific advice to India-based technology companies. With that, I'm going to wrap it up, and we are going to lead into some questions.
Sure. Thanks so much, Liz. That was fairly informative. Please.
Thanks.
So before I open it up to the floor, I'll open up the question and then now. So Liz, you've been doing this for 15 years. Okay, the last 2 years have been extremely disruptive. Everybody's thinking differently. When you are advising your customers who are now buying stuff through different models and vendors and software, what has changed in terms of your advice to the customer in the last 2 years?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier about the buying cycle. In the past, we got a lot of phone calls about formal RFPs. We helped clients write RFPs. We reviewed massive contracts alongside of them. And more recently, when a client comes to me and says, can you look at this RFP? My first response is, what are you trying to get out of the RFP? In fact, sometimes if I know them or if they seem not too formal, I'll say, have any of the RFPs you've used in the past really been particularly effective? And usually they'll laugh, because we can all admit, whether you're on the responding end or the writing end of these things, they haven't been that effective. And in a lot of cases, the person who's soliciting the work doesn't even read all the RFPs. You know, and we used to have this model, and I can think of, you know, clients who are sponsoring Forrester even saying it to me, if that RFP doesn't look really thick, they're not going to be happy. Is that our metric of success? Of course not. So I mean, that's a huge thing that's changed. And some of these ideas are unpopular right now. So I mean, we certainly still have clients who think that this is maybe true for some small purchases, but they would never really overhaul the way they're doing business. And I guess time will tell if that can prove to be a successful strategy. You know my hypothesis on it.
Sure, sure. Just one leading on, in terms of you know, the models, how open are customers to explore some of, especially the ones for whom things have been working for 20 years? They got good good vendor relationships, and they have known their partners for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. You know, I find the clients who are the hardest to think in new ways are the ones who are very successful. And also, you know, there's certain industries where the customer's pretty locked in. So the disruption that's coming, it's not easy for the customer to change quickly. So if you look at banking and insurance, you know, we can change quickly. So innovation is high. But if you look at other industries like aircraft manufacturing, the orders are already in through 2020. And so the pressure on innovation shrinks a little bit. And I think that's a real conundrum, because sometimes it makes it harder to take those bets. You know, I'd say, to state the obvious, I mean, this is why many companies have now talked about going private, because also they don't want if they have been very successful, they don't want to have to start answering these questions about what's dipping in the numbers, even though, you know, longer term, many of them would admit that it's better for them.
Sure. All right, any questions, guys?
Hi, this is Ram here. I'm from Pfizer, right here.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Liz, for walking us through on the trends and what to look for this decade and perhaps the next. I've been looking at some of the trends that you have been talking about. The pie number 3 is the artificial intelligence piece, which all of us believe is going to change the way that we work, learn, and do things generally. One of the observations that I've been reading through a report this morning, where big data or thick data, whatever you call it, has been the base for some of the industry trends that's likely to happen this year. But the studies show that most projects, almost 70% of the projects that they started with the big data as the turnaround strategy for industries has not been very successful. And this AI piece is entirely dependent on big data.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? So if the big data fails, AI also fails. Whatever you have as an intelligent piece right on top is going to fail if the framework or the base is not strong enough. So what's your view on that? Any research, any pointers that Forrester has for us there?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly our view. This is why my colleagues titled it "The Honeymoon for AI is Over," because so many companies believe that moving to big data or data lake or some AI tools would solve these classic problems that really exist in greater fashion than before. And so actually they did a pretty interesting report on it. Definitely anyone who's a client can get access to it. If you're not, you can email me and I can find out what we might be able to share with you. But this is exactly what they're talking about, is that we're now going to have to move into some real hard work to be able to get these things to be successful. And it's a conundrum too, because you see a lot of companies, often very successful companies, believe we want to jump in and get started and experiment. That if we step so far back that we're doing these massive planning exercises and planning out everything about the data hygiene and the big data tools we're going to use and all the rest of it, we'll never get started and we'll lose ground that way. So to me, this is one of the reasons why it's such a conundrum for the buyers is you go fast and you are going to make a lot more mistakes. But how do you stop yourself from then going too far the other way and doing so much planning that by the time you're ready to implement, the game's already changed? So
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think we have one over here.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Bala from Congruent Solutions.
Hi.
One of the slides made interesting reading. You're saying there is a new tech buying cycle. And we try and deal with a lot of these Fortune 500 companies to make a breakthrough for our product. And while the business and operations and sometimes even technology is on board, all these guys have a huge monster called procurement or vendor management, which actually doesn't want to let them bypass the existing processes of buying, like RFP you mentioned. Do you see that changing at all, or?
So I've noticed a few factors at play. Definitely I see what you're seeing, which is a lot of procurement groups haven't changed, and they tend to serve more as a blocker for success than really helping at this point. I do see some procurement people hungry to change, especially if they've got some life left in their career. They see the writings on the wall and they want to change. We actively run training and education for sourcing and vendor management professionals, and we try to not only share our views, but also bring in peers who can speak from their own experience into what they did differently that was disruptive. But I'll say, frankly, the biggest change I see at a company doing this well is when it gets to a high enough level in the company that procurement's not going to stop anything. So, for example, I was with an insurance company a few months ago. They're all in on Salesforce. They love it. They're moving quick. They're buying things, and it looked a little bit siloed what they were doing. And one of the questions I asked them, I said, I'm really surprised. How did you all come to this? And they said, well, a couple of years ago it was very different, but our CEO told us this is what we're doing, and if you're not going to do it, get out. So, I think that change from the top can go a long way. Most procurement people I know are not going to stick their neck out against the CEO word, so that would be something. And I think, too, I know some procurement people that I've worked with, they've done what they were supposed to do for years. And it's hard for them to really understand sometimes what the change is, and that's where, whether it's top executive or peers, educating them can sometimes go a long way. I'll never forget, I was in this meeting of procurement executives, and this one manufacturing procurement leader said, well, we never use cloud, and we can't. And I heard his CIO speaking at a conference soon after that, talking about, cloud first, we're all in on the cloud. I'm sure if that guy knew that that was what the CIO was saying, he would have had a different tune, right? No one wants to be in that position in the company. So hopefully that gives some of our perspectives. And I saw one over here. Yes, red tie.
You can use this one.
See, we're flexible and agile.
Thank you. My name is Kumar. Thank you. Very good presentation by you. Couple of questions. One, of course, you did mention that the old way of giving it cheaper and better, more about heads, bumps on seats, as you call it, is going away. And of course, most of that will get automated. And then, of course, the new way of looking at opportunities for countries like India in terms of leveraging talent will be something different in terms of reskilling or doing different things. And that you talked about has to do more with cross-training or upskilling or more about adoption, consumption, all of that. Am I right?
Yep.
And so just going back on that, so we do have a company with about 40,000 people, and the headcount has not gone down yet. And we find that we are ready because we have the customer experience labs. We're not able to get the decision makers to go there. And the people who are procurement do not understand. They still want to go the same old way. We want to change the contract from the way it's now contracted in terms of bumps on seats to outcome. But the procurement and the other people who are running it are not ready for it. Many of the times, the client's data infrastructure are not ready to take in what we can actually bring in what we do because they have a lot of other vendors doing the same thing. So I don't see in the near future this going away. In fact, we are struggling to transform and finding difficult to transform our clients to do things in a better way and change the way we can actually do in terms of moving it to outcome.
And we see exactly the same thing, right? Not everybody's moving all at once. But our advice, if you're a supplier, for someone like yourself, is that more and more these trends are clear. I mean, the cloud data for me is one of the most compelling shifts, is that people were kind of naysaying the cloud for its first decade, and now we've started to see these massive shifts. European companies, Canadian companies, banking, moving more aggressively to the cloud. Yes, the naysayers are still in there. Like any massive disruption, it's not going to all happen at the same pace, and broadly speaking, it will take time. But with AI and automation, I think we're really just a couple years away from something more massive. If you look at what people have been investing in and how automation is going to start disrupting things, to me, that may change before really the buyer, because everybody's a little bit hard to change. People do things a certain way. Human ability to change will be there, and you have a lot of executives who are going to thrive on in their companies. But that automation piece seems to be something in the nearer term that could tip that a bit more. So,
actually, what we see, and I would love to hear your point of view, is customers, they don't know how to measure it. I think the fear is of measurement.
yeah.
I mean, it's easy for me that you have to do A, B, and C, and so
Yep.
I'll pay you. But I don't know how to measure and the outcome. I mean, I'm not equipped. Is that the fear, or?
Well, that's definitely part of it, and I think this trend towards platforms helps too. I was having lunch with someone today, and we were talking about a similar, or had a meeting earlier today, and we were talking about a similar idea, which is once you have a platform and you can show a model of pay per outcome, and you can show a different way of working, sometimes that makes it easier for the next buyer to get on board because they don't feel like they have to think through all of that. I mean, the other key thing to say here too is trust. A lot of these outcome-based contracts over the last many years, they really fall down when there's not a trusted relationship. I worked with a big chemicals company a few years ago, and they wanted an outcome-based relationship, but behind the scenes, they were playing a game with what they were saying they wanted. They thought they'd get one up on the supplier. And you see a lot of suppliers pad the outcomes, pad this, they want to make sure they're getting one up on the buyer. And so unless there's some kind of true incentive that is aligned, you tend to see a lot of games and mistrust, and then they tend to fall apart. So I know that's something we've seen.
Sure.
Right. Hi. Here.
Okay.
I'm happy. My name is Jonu Rana. I'm from QGlue QAI. And it's regarding, you talked about reskilling. It's just an extension to that you talked about reskilling, and you did talk about design thinking and how Infosys has trained like zillions, or not zillions, maybe thousands. And you did, but you did not mention design thinking as a service, as a disruptive stuff, or, as a key skill. Because I did see you talk about digital studios, which did sound like design thinking in terms of ideation and prototyping. So do you think design, because, training is training, but then application of skill, in terms of coaching, do you think design thinking as a service which might be of fruit to India?
So we're already seeing services engagements that are design thinking. They may not be truly as a service, but it's a service around design thinking. IBM is doing a lot of this. PwC is doing this.
Yeah, we are also doing.
And you're also doing it. I thought that might be in there. I think, though, you're reminding me of another trend, which I didn't really get into, which is we are seeing services go to an as-a-service model, much more flexible, fluid. Crowdsource is something I'm hearing in the conversation from major suppliers that I wouldn't have expected. Some of you would know Wipro has bought a company that along with it came some crowdsource. Accenture's been doing work with various crowdsource partners. So that's another part of the as a service is I think we will see, and people often talk about this as the gig economy, right? That this kind of incremental, more fluid working nature generally. And what I'm seeing is design thinking can be part of that as well. The only caution I would say is, design thinking is not the kind of activity that can be fully outsourced, right? When you're talking about reinventing the business, reinventing the customer, it has to be still in partnership with your customer to done well. At least that's what I've seen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. One last? Okay. Please use the mic.
Yeah, thank you so much for the crisp and very insightful presentation. So my question for you is a little bit left field. So let's say 5 years from now, you have another Infosys or another Cognizant emerge from India. Right now, how would the company smell like, feel like, look like? Yeah?
I think one thing to point out is a lot of today's leading biggest suppliers are the ones that are going to reemerge. I've seen more appetite amongst services and software providers who are leading to disrupt themselves in the last 2 years than I've seen in my career. But I think, someone who's starting fresh and new, and actually a lot of the companies that have been acquired, like Blue Wolf that IBM acquired, Aperio that Wipro acquired, these are fledgling compared to the big giants. But you see they all have a few things. They all work in an agile way, and they make that a tenet of who they are. They mostly gravitate towards cloud solutions. And by the way, cloud and agile tend to go pretty well together. They tend to be more fluid and entrepreneurial, which sometimes is the antithesis of a larger company, and sometimes when getting bigger, that doesn't scale. But to be able to think creatively and not simply deliver what clients are asking for, and really make that a part of their DNA and a part of what they serve to the market. Those would be some things I'd look at. For me, what's always been hard when you track these small companies, a lot of times when they get big, they exhibit all the same protectionist behaviors and silos and organizational issues that the big companies do. So who can have all of those qualities but also do it at scale? And I didn't really hit on it too much, but just the last comment on one of the slides, I talked about this new model we're seeing emerge, which is the convergence of business, technology, and creative. You see a lot of service providers and even software providers talking about this now. To me, that being part of the DNA is a hallmark of a services company, big or small, who will lead in the future. Is who can, everybody can say they have it. Oh, we bought an agency here, and we've got tech, and we do consulting. Who can really bring that together in a way that's meaningful for the client is much harder than just having all the different capabilities. So that's a piece I'd look for also.
Thank you.
All right, folks.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Thanks a lot. That was a wonderful presentation as well, worth our effort of getting through the windows. Yeah. Small token of appreciation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
So, folks, we break now, and we come back here for the Analyst Corner 3 at 3:30. The topic is on the secret source of digital one office framework, the future of business operations. This will be by Phil from HFS Research.